we're going to actually go through some situations. And what I tried to do is pull out different situations that and different scenarios that that I think you would encounter. And I really want this piece to be interactive, where we will look at the situation, we'll kind of talk about why it matters, and then we'll talk about, why it happens and what are some of the things that we can do to mitigate some of these situations. So the first one is around meeting dynamics. So you notice that your colleague, who's a woman, gets spoken over and interrupted more often than others during virtual team meetings. So why do you think this happens?
I think it happens in part because some people have really strong personalities and they aren't shy about being vocal.
Yeah. Anyone else?
In the chat, it says people don't think women may have something as important to say.
Mm. Yeah. And so, and I also think that sometimes people feel like they have to fill the space with their voice, and that their voice has to, kind of constantly be out there. So, one of the things in terms of why it happens, yeah, in general, women are interrupted far more than men, and women also interrupt other women in meetings. Again, because, wanting to be seen, wanting to be heard. I think it happens a lot in virtual meetings, because just kind of, just in terms of meeting logistics, not knowing when someone else is going to say something. And so there's a tendency to interrupt. But also I think that, in terms of interruptions, not just valuing what it is that someone has to say. So
and there's another new message in the chat. It says people don't think that they are as knowledgeable.
Or I think there's also a fear, yes, they don't think that they're knowledgeable, or there's also a fear of saying something wrong, right? That what you're saying may not be the right thing, or people may not necessarily agree with what it is that you're saying. So why this matters is that if a woman's ideas and her voice is not being heard, and if she's being interrupted, then there's going to be a tendency for her to just want to regress and kick back and then not share, right? And not contribute. And then her not being seen as a key contributor has an impact on how others view her as, a leader, and how others view her within the organization. And again, just feeling like, I know I've been in situations where I've been in meetings and I will make a statement and someone will say, well, what Valerie means is, and I have always found that to be very challenging, because I know what I mean. I know what I said. If what I said was not clear, I can explain myself, but I don't need someone to interpret what it is that I'm saying. And that has always been a big issue with me, in terms of, someone trying to interpret what it is that I'm saying to a larger group. So what do you think go ahead.
Oh, sorry. We have another new chat. It says, absolutely, this becomes even more difficult when you're not seen or heard based on your race and gender. And someone else said, wow, someone saying what Valerie really means is.
Yeah, like, yeah.
And then there's a question. Sorry, our chat is exploding a little bit. How much of this involves someone's physical presence?
Yeah, I was gonna, let's talk about that a little bit, because I know sometimes when we're on virtual meetings, right, we have our video off, right? And so sometimes there's a tendency to just feel like we're hiding a little bit when we don't have our videos on. And so I think when you're meeting in person, I think that there's a tendency to do it more. At least that's been my experience. I'd be interested to hear what other folks, what you've experienced in terms of the difference of virtual versus in person. No? So if there's a culture of interruption with that organization, some of the things that you might do is to say, I'd like to hear more of what, let's say Mary, I'd like to hear more of what Mary has to say. Or Mary raised an important point and I'd like to consider what she's saying before we move on, right? So that you're giving credit to Mary, you're acknowledging what it is that she said, you're acknowledging her contribution, and you're refocusing that discussion back to her and her ideas, and you're validating her.
You know, I think it's also imperative that not only do we do what you just exemplified in our organizations, but we do it across organizations for other counselors. I know that in person for court, a lot of times as a female attorney, especially as a Black female attorney, I am interrupted, and I don't see. I think it would behoove us if our judiciary also would recognize and speak up when we are interrupted. But I think it is also good. I noticed in a lot of mediations that if it is more male dominated and if there's another woman, I have often spoke up, even though we're not in the same firm, and said, well, I see so-and-so, she's been raising her hand, or she's been looking for an opportunity to speak and she hasn't had it. So I think it really behooves us to be advocates for one another when we see that someone is not being recognized or acknowledged. And I think that's important for men to do that as well.
Yes, yes. And so this kind of goes back to the performance bias where women are not seen as being as qualified as men, right? And so by you speaking up and being an advocate, it's kind of definitely raising that awareness. If another thing that you can do is, if you're in a virtual meeting, ask folks that have not had an opportunity to speak, invite them to speak, right? Where you're inviting them, where you're establishing this kind of inclusivity, and when you're inviting them to share their opinion. We've got a few, so I'm gonna go ahead and move us on. So this is very similar. A woman suggests an idea in a meeting and it falls flat. A few minutes later, a man suggests the same idea and gets enthusiastic reaction. Ugh, I can't stand that, right? It's like, what am I, chopped liver? I mean, I just said that, right? So getting credit for your ideas are important just as much as, you know, getting noticed, right? And so this is kind of going back to the first point that we raised about being seen and being heard and given credit for your contributions. Anyone else? It's kind of similar to our performance, the one that we just had. I'm going to move us on a little bit because I want to share. So you're on a team during the performance reviews and notice that a lot of women give feedback on their speaking style. So I have quite a few clients that, quite a few Asian women, and they get feedback on their speaking style in terms of them being too soft and not aggressive enough. And remember when I talked about performance feedback and I said, if you're not specific and you just give this generic feedback, it's really hard to make a change and it's really hard to understand what it is that you need to do. And it's also very subjective because your speaking style does not have an impact on your ability to lead or your competency. And so oftentimes my clients really, really struggle with this. So can you think of some examples of why this happens? So I think a lot of it is underestimating the woman's performance, right? Instead of focusing on her performance and what it is that she's doing, the focus is on her speaking style. And then if you're in a performance review, is it your style of speak or is it what you're able to produce? And so it's really a matter of bringing the conversation back to how are we actually evaluating performance, right?
Well, someone put stereotyping, and Rose, I completely agree with that, because, you know I have that implicit bias on someone with a Southern accent. If you have a Southern accent, it's kind of default to think that they're not as smart, or they're not, their views aren't as valid. So I think it's coming down to that implicit bias that you were talking about, but a lot of stereotyping. And it could even be a stereotype about a degree, that someone may be an admin that comes up with a very good suggestion in a meeting, but hey, you have a high school degree, I have a doctoral degree. It could be a little bit of that also.
Perhaps others want you to be more like them or think their way is right. And that really resonated with me, because if you have mostly men in the supervisory positions and you have women that are subordinates, I guess, their speaking style might not be able to match their supervisors. And so I think there is a lot of bias when someone isn't like you.
Or what if you have an accent when you speak, right? Doesn't have anything to do with your ability, but the other person has difficulty understanding what it is that you're saying. And I've had this with some of my clients where they've tried, different techniques, and sometimes it's not with them. Sometimes it's with the individual just having this block against the fact that there's an accent when speaking. I've also had clients where, they've been told that in order to advance to the leadership position, you have to be aggressive, you have to be assertive. And sometimes that's hard when that's not how they were raised. If they were raised in a culture and a background where they were a little bit more submissive and they have another way of communicating, but it's just as effective. But if you're only looking for them to be assertive, then you miss out on what it is that they can bring. And so when we notice this happen, we can focus on the substance of what the person is saying and not their style, and then refocus people to get back to the substance versus the style. Another thing that you could do is go looking at HR and recommend that you have some standardization in the performance reviews, right? Because speaking style is not one of the criteria that you use on performance reviews. And then maybe kind of consider some training in terms of looking at anti-bias training for employees that are involved in the performance review. I think the other thing here that I have in my notes, when people understand how biases impact their decision-making, they're able to make more objective decisions. And so it's raising awareness that this is not really objective, but it's more subjective, and it's harder to deal with and harder to address. So here's one. A coworker says of a Black woman on another team, "Why does she always seem so angry?" Labeling, why it matters. Labeling a Black woman angry can hurt her at work, right? It can hurt her. When you're labeled as angry, every emotion that you have is then put into this anger category. So it takes away, if you have, if you're frustrated, it takes away all of these different emotions. It takes away from the content. It takes away from the situation, because now it just seems like it's put on this individual and she has to fight against quote unquote anger. Comments like these can invalidate her point of view, which means that the company loses out on her contributions. Let's talk about this one. Have you heard it before?
Oh, definitely. I think that's a huge stereotype that we hear pretty often. And I think that it's increased since last summer when there were marches across the country. I feel like now it's even more prevalent.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Anyone else? So, I mean, just think about it. Is everything anger? Aren't there other emotions? And so by not putting yourself into that person's situation or perspective, you kind of devalue what she's bringing or who she is as an individual or who she is as a person. And it also says that the myth of the angry Black woman is a racist trope popularized in media since the Jim Crow era. It's a way of criticizing and dismissing women who don't conform. They could be frustrated. They could have been trying to have this conversation over and over and over, and that no one is listening. So it's frustration. And so think of it as an iceberg, right? There's all of these things going on underneath, and you're only seeing one thing that kind of bubbles up to the top, but you don't know all of the things that have contributed to that. So one of the things that you can say, instead of labeling this individual as an angry Black woman, is saying, you know, just asking a question. What makes you say that?
Yeah. And Rose,
remember we talked about going deeper, being curious, asking questions, like, you know, instead of putting this person on the defensive, like, what makes you say that? Why do you think she's angry? And, you know, be open to the dialogue, be open to the conversation. Like, you know, why do you think she's coming across that way, right? Maybe she's asked a question or has been looking for support and no one's hearing her. So it's being intentional about asking those questions, digging deeper. Also realizing that this stereotype can just take its toll on Black women, right? It could just be exhausting because you're just like, not again, I don't want to have to go through this. Or you can, and I'll share my own perspective. I can say, I don't want to be labeled as an angry Black woman. So therefore, I'm not going to be as vocal and as verbal and come across with as much passion as I normally would, right? And I'm not being true to myself because I don't want to be viewed as this angry Black woman. I want to be viewed as somebody that's got more tools in her toolbox that can relate to you and talk to you a certain way. But deep down inside, I may not want to do that. I may want to be passionate. I may want to be angry. All right. So I think that the thing here is engage, have more conversations, dig deeper, be curious, ask questions. So I don't see color.
Oh, I hate this one. I'm sorry. I didn't even want to wait for Shannon. I'm sorry. I hate this one. If you can't see color, you can't see me.
Yeah, yeah. I get this a lot from white men that I'm having conversations with that are between ages maybe 50 and 60, 50 and 70. And they go, I don't see color. And I believe it's their way of trying to let me know that we're good, we're okay. But like Pat Tanisha said, if you don't see color, you don't see me. You're ignoring that racism exists. There's this, you know, colorblind. And then we're not really dealing with the issue. We're not really dealing with the problem. We could also say, you know, what can we do about it? We can acknowledge someone's race. Like, what's wrong with saying, I see color? What's wrong with saying, yes, you're white, you're Black, I see color? What's wrong with acknowledging that? And then going deeper and have that conversation. So I'm looking at the time and I want to get us going here. You're talking to a woman of color on your team, a coworker from another team joins you and assumes she's much more junior than she really is. She's the boss lady, the head lady in charge, and they just look at her color and they just go, she's, you know, junior. So they've just made this snap judgment that she couldn't possibly be running the organization, right? And so, and that happens. I'm sure that happens. I'm sure that's happened to some of you all, right? And so again, it's taking the time to set the record straight to say, no, this is the COO of our company and she does blah, blah, blah. And letting them know, yes, this is a person in authority, and kind of giving her respect. Anybody want to share anything on this one?
I heard a story that Loretta Lynch told at a keynote she did, and how someone had thought that she wasn't supposed to be where she was, only to realize she is the head honcho in charge. And I think they very much regretted that.
Yeah. So I'm going to move us along because I have a few more examples. So the day after a high-profile killing of a Black person by police, coworkers are discussing the news, but nobody brings up the story, right? And so I know that I've had a client where she was the only woman of color in her department, and she was just really, really sad that no one came to her, asked her how she was feeling, asked her what was going on, and asked her, just how's she doing. So the silence suggests that non-Black colleagues, they're not as outraged, they're not as as outraged by the trauma. It's also a good point to have conversation and dialogue about how you feel about particular situations. It's okay to talk about, if there are some racially motivated killings or something, it's okay to have that discussion and dialogue, but not saying anything just leaves people feeling flat, especially if these are folks that you're working with. And it's almost like the I don't see color situation. So this is an example. It says, when a Black person is killed by police, it reminds all Black people of the violence that threatens their lives. And there's some issues, there's stuff that bubbles up. So by having the conversation at work, you're able to exchange dialogue, and you're able to just, kind of understand a little bit more from the other person's perspective. This one real quick, you hear a white coworker say they're not privileged because they grew up poor. And I think the takeaway here is, yes, you grew up poor, but you didn't have to grow up dealing with racial injustices, right? So yeah, you didn't have to, you may both be poor, but being poor and Black in America and being poor and white in America are two different things, right? And so again, it's validating the other person's perspective, and it's saying, yeah, there is a difference, there is this disparity here, right? And let's do the last one is, I'm the only woman on the team. So this could be, I'm the only woman on the team, I'm the only minority woman on the team, I'm the first to do this. And that's a hard spot to be in, the onlys, right? Where they have a worse experience than other women. They're the only ones, they're the first ones, the challenges, unprofessional remarks, just mentally having to deal with all of the challenges and be up and stay up all of the time. And, I think this is really, in terms of what we can do about this, if you find yourself like the only woman on the team or the only minority, networking with other women, reaching out or trying to have that, bond where you have other women where you can, network with, and have a place where you can kind of talk about these issues, but also realizing that, it may not necessarily be the case now, although with Kamala Harris, right? Kamala Harris, in terms of just the things that she's had to do in terms of the first, right? And being the only, and it does still happen.